started. I think everybody has been here before and knows everybody else. If not, speak up. We don't have to do that. The first item is a draft summary from the May 5th meeting. Are there any comments, corrections, additions, anything at all in minutes on the summary? Seeing none, we'll accept those as submitted, and that will allow us to move to the continued discussion of Imagine Nicholasville Road. And I've got a few notes, and I guess I'll open the floor for those who were there about kind of where you think we stand, what the feedback was. The brief notes are on this one page. I don't know if we need to add to that, but anyway, people's sense of those two meetings. Everybody jump in, start.
I thought both meetings were very productive, Vice Mayor. The meetings with the property owners and then the meeting with the neighborhood. And I felt like that we didn't hear anything that would cause us to change directions at this point.
Okay. I guess.
And we also had a follow-up individual meeting, if you'd like a report on that as well too.
Well, yes, I think that would be. Oh, this was the one person who was a homeowner.
Yes.
In the area.
Yes. Chris and Hal, I believe, did Hal go to that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Chris and Hal attended that. So.
Yeah, we went to Kathy Sisney's house with Councilmember Legree and had about an hour and 15-minute conversation with the resident and just talked through process and time and long-range vision of sort of growth in the area. She just has a lot of concerns. She's approached regularly about her property being sold. So, she's got a different viewpoint than a lot of folks. So she's concerned, and she was worried about, So that's some misconceptions about, government purchase of the property or government takeover of the property, condemnation, those sorts of things. We just clarified that that's, what the process would be, what the process would not be. And so it was a good conversation. I think we've invited her and encouraged her to attend these meetings, to be a part of the discussion, so she would be well apprised of whatever the group was talking about and the next steps, and that we would keep her in the loop, and that she's got the ability to contact us at any time and then talk through anything that she's thinking on it. She's not in support and she's not in opposition. She's just listening to see where it goes from here. So it was a good conversation, but I don't think it moved anything substantially for her.
Okay. Yeah.
I was particularly interested to hear if you got any feedback on the south of Waller. I figured that would be the area that maybe we were questioning, like what was the community sentiment about that. There seemed to always be more acknowledgement that the north side was a little bit clearer.
So
did you get much?
Prior to the meeting that was held with the neighboring properties, not so much the ownership, I did have several conversations with a representative from the Pensacola Park Neighborhood Association, and there is a real concern of creep and a concern of not getting the same type of infrastructure that would lead to what is called for within Imagine Nicholasville Road. So there is a concern overall about this continuing down Nicholasville Road and not getting the supportive infrastructure, bike lanes, pedestrian increased infrastructure, or the transit options in this area. It would just basically lead to more development rather than getting something that is better development. I think that is the overall concern from some of the members of that area, but there were not many individuals that spoke during our community outreach meeting during that night.
I was going to say, I was surprised that there were as few near neighborhood like points of input as there were. Like, because we reached out
Yeah.
pretty extensively, and I figured there would be, if anybody was been out of shape about it, we would see a lot more people showing up, and you know, we didn't see a ton of folks there, which I'm going to assume is a neutral position at least.
We reached out directly to about 170 people in adjacent neighborhoods through our.
I mean,
database.
that's a significant outreach in that area between direct contact and people talking to each other, you know.
So I don't know if we can answer this question off the top of anybody's head, but the question of creep, I don't think that change necessarily would mean that we were looking at the next set of neighborhoods down
No.
for similar action. In fact, I mean, my thought is we would be looking other places, other types, you know, as we've talked about before. So, and one of the things I've learned is you can't guarantee anybody that something won't happen. People say, well, this could happen. Well, you can't, you know, you don't have control over all circumstances. However, I think it's a fair response to that particular individual who sent a long email to me. I don't know if everybody else got it,
Yep.
but is to say that's not anything like the intention of what we're doing with this particular parcel. It was identified as relatively unique, given its place, and that if and as we go forward with this and it's successful, we would be potentially looking at different places, but other places, and not necessarily adjacent. Is that fair to say? I mean,
And I would punctuate that, Vice Mayor, by saying this opportunity with the UK acquisition boundary is really, in addition to the imagined Nicholasville Road plan, the two of those come together only at one point, and that is right here. And so that wouldn't likely happen elsewhere on the corridor, or at least further south anyway.
And not to mention the conjunction of a major arterial and a minor arterial being right there in terms of transit-oriented development. I mean, that's a pretty significant impact as well in terms of decision-making.
yeah, so that area is distinctive in a couple of ways that moving further south is simply not the case. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
I would also say that there are two boundaries to continued scope creep down this portion of what Nicholasville Road calls the neighborhood typology, and the fact that there are established H1 overlays, not just one, but two, that would halt changes in increased housing or in many cases density and a few other things as we would move down Nicholasville, if there would ever be a want to move down Nicholasville.
And a park is a physical boundary. Like, there's a park right there, Elizabeth Street Park, that just kind of almost hits the brakes before you get to the historic neighborhoods.
Okay. Does anybody have a different take on it or additional comments before I suggest what the next steps are, or I ask about that?
I just was curious what the turnout was for the neighborhood one. I wasn't able to attend.
Half a dozen?
10 or 15?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Welcome.
Total on the meeting, I believe it was 28, and the vast majority of that 28 was, or a
I
large
guess I was
portion
thinking
was
about
staff.
the owners, which was a smaller group.
Yeah.
Except the May 12.
Yes.
Okay, so-
Cool. Yeah. Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I, thinking again about the meeting with the neighbors as opposed to the owners, it seemed to me that it was a fairly robust conversation. It was not that people didn't have anything to say, but what they said was mostly trying to figure out what we were thinking about, and some support. So, okay, yes.
One last comment. I did feel like some of the letters that were forwarded to us as well did echo some of the concerns that we had talked about originally about focusing in a more residential area versus the more of the commercial areas of Nicholasville Road. So I just want to uplift that, and so we keep it top of mind as we move forward and identify different sites. I mean, I do think that was a valid concern for some of those folks of, you know, are we going to be looking at more primarily commercial areas that we could change the zoning on as well as the more residential areas. So
Yeah, I think, I would agree that when we're looking at residential area, whether it's homeowner or primarily renter, it's different. There's a potential for what we now call involuntary displacement, but yeah, and making, kind of reducing the amount of rental property, which is not what the intention is at all.
and just that those, you know, commercial areas do offer some more opportunities than
Yeah.
the primarily residential ones may.
Okay. So, anybody else, any other comments? So, next steps, would that be to ask planning staff to draft a particular suggestion for what the upzone might look like? And bring that back for discussion, or what else?
Well, and that's an option. We could work on that, and knowing that there would not be an associated development plan or a subdivision or anything like that associated. This would just be identifying the new zones and any potential conditions that we want to post on that. So we can make it happen.
Yeah, I think that's what, part of what we heard was, yeah, in principle, this might be okay, but until we see what the new zone being proposed might look like and what the restrictions are, we don't really know, so, yeah.
See, is this question, we kind of talked about it the last meeting, I think Walter mentioned it in his email about not being able to come today. In that upzoning, is there a process or a vehicle to build in some detail and attention to what a form-based code would do were it in place, but look at the form and character and compatibility so it's a cohesive, more orderly, pleasant development?
I think that's
Is there a vehicle to explore that in this upzoning, some sort of special category, some sort of something that gives room to do that?
And Hal, help me out here if you think, but I think as the government initiating this, I think we've got some opportunity to do something like this that perhaps we couldn't expect a private developer to necessarily do, or a private property owner to do. So I believe we've got the tools within our division to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, the place builder hints at that, and then
Right.
that section of B3 that lets you do form-based under certain exceptions.
B1.
In B1, whatever it was,
Right.
yeah. But that, it's pretty loosely worded. I would hope it'd be more specifically worded. But yeah, if there's room, it seems like so much we hear is not the use, it's the compatibility of what's the built form.
And I think that there are ways for us to get at that with conditional zoning restrictions, which get at the density, buffering, heights, things like that. I think that when it comes into specific form, it is somewhat more problematic with what we have within our zoning ordinance and what it allots us. And with the B1, while it does allow us to do some form-based code, it does also restrict some of the uses within that. And I say restrict, it allows for flexibility, but it does not allow for residential to occur on the first floor. And we have heard from several developers that they would
Yeah.
like to have multifamily, but not be required to have that B1 or that business on the
I don't
first
think it
floor.
specifically is a good example, but just.
Yeah, there are ways for us to form this a bit, but I don't know if we currently have a way to do it in the depth or perspective that many other form-based
Yeah,
communities
no,
do.
I know you can't go that far, but when you grant that upzoning, you're granting them a big, huge financial benefit. It seems like fair exchange within what's allowed.
Yes.
We ought to get some public benefit from that huge granting of financial benefit.
Yeah.
I mean, the extent you can.
You got it. Stan?
Given the concerns over the infrastructure, I was just curious, what's the status of Waller Avenue in the 6-year plan? Do we know anything?
That has come up, but I don't recall, Stan.
I guess that might be another, to me, next step is talk to the NPO about Waller as a complete street, and whether that's something that at least can start being thought of in the capital improvements, you know, the transportation improvements plan. I know that probably would extend over to Broadway, but, so, it's not just this area. I don't think you do it just for this area, but it seems like that's kind of part of the concern too, is can we get the same thing of like, can we start thinking more, when we've got this opportunity with redevelopment, can we at least leverage it to do more complete street improvements as it happens?
Okay, other thoughts, comments?
I have a quick question. I probably already know the answer to it, but I'll ask it anyway. What if we, just imagine, we passed a complete streets policy, would that attach to any work on Waller? Or because there would be somebody else doing the work that, like this, if the state decided to come in and do something, would our local complete streets policy have any input on what they decided to do, assuming we passed one?
Well, let me expand the question. The state is working on their own complete streets
Okay, all
policy
right.
as well. So we would, now that would be, you know, of course, for their properties only, but, and we would certainly try to apply any new policies that we had to these kind of developments as well. But a lot of the outcomes of our policy are going to be changes in regulations. So the policy is really going to direct us to update our regulations more so than just apply an idea to something. So we can push it as far as we can, but the win of a complete streets policy is going to be the change of the regulations that comes after it.
Okay, anything else? So, I was going to say for our next meeting, and there's a question that I was holding for the end, but maybe we ought to address it now. Right now, typically we break in the summer, so we would not have another meeting now until September. And July and August are both difficult to schedule, but I wonder, my sense is it would be useful to have something before September. And so, you know, and I'm one of the people who offers constraints, since I'll be gone for about 3 weeks in the middle of all that. But I wonder, before we're done, if we could look at a time early in July, not the first Wednesday, that's the 4th of July, I believe. But anyway, if we could look for a date or a time that we might get back together in July. Unless there's objection, we'll do that before we adjourn. But is that acceptable to staff?
I'll just for your information, we're working on a project for Councilmember Brown, and we're starting a new project with the Vice Mayor, so just...
Are you really?
Yeah, so just that September 7th looked awfully appealing. Just...
Well, I hear that.
But we will absolutely do whatever we need to do.
Yeah, and I guess I'm with that other hat on, I'm sensitive to the issue of scheduling, since I've already hit a wall with the first attempt to schedule for that new work group. Okay, well, we'll discuss this at the end. Okay, anything else on that at this point? All right, great. Then infill and boundary.
Yes, sir. I feel like I'm going to be talking a bit today, but this does go through a little bit of how we came about the infill and redevelopment boundary within Lexington. I know that there's been a bit of conversation with regards to this and how it was established in 2007. And this hopefully gives a bit of background and research to it without me going into the beginning of zoning at the early part of the 20th century. So just a quick review of the history of the infill and redevelopment initiative. It really does start with the 1996 comprehensive plan and is associated with some of the expansion that we did during that plan. The expansion area master plan was associated with that, and that was really the main focus of that comprehensive plan. But there was also a focus on trying to make sure that we were doing appropriate infill and infill that complemented what was already established in our areas. In 2001, we get into the comprehensive plan in which we start to look at a few more of the design standards, which led into the design standards themselves. 2007, we go a bit further with the establishment of some of our boundaries. And then 2009, we have the non-residential design standards. There have been a series of text amendments. I'll go through these in a little bit more detail as we go along. But starting in 2002, we really started to implement what was the focus of infill and redevelopment standards in Lexington. And then leading to 2012, which was the last iteration of this body's push for ZODAs. I will say many of the ZODAs that were discussed, even in 2002, are ZODAs that planning staff are currently working on, including one that was just passed, which was discussed in 2002, and even in 1996, which was the addition of ADUs in our community. Just jumping into the 1996 plan, this is really the start of a full broad discussion of infill and redevelopment policies within Lexington. We were starting to feel a little bit more of the crunch of the urban service boundary, and there was a need to reorient ourselves in how things were being developed, as well as trying to make sure that the community was being representative with the housing that was there. What was happening was a fair amount of the areas around town had been upzoned in previous years, specifically in 1969. In this 1996 comprehensive plan, there was a conversation of maybe right-sizing many of those properties. Those early discussions led to a fair amount of downzonings throughout our community, with the idea that there were going to be upzonings. The upzonings did not really come to fruition. The downzonings definitely did in several areas. This is based off of the 1993 Infill and Redevelopment Committee report. It's a very interesting report that recommends a lot of different focuses on transit, on trying to get density on corridors, a few other things that we're really getting at to in a lot of what we're doing nowadays. It did focus on a core and frame concept. If you think about our downtown zoning, we have our frame or our core downtown zone, and then we have the B2A zone, which is a frame. It was this perspective that as you get further out from the densest part of an area, you have slightly less density, slightly less height, and then into more suburbanized areas. So there are different policies that are set up in these different areas, as well as an inventory of different sites that could be developed in the downtown and downtown adjacent areas. In 2001, we see the first map that is associated with the infill and redevelopment area. This was really focusing in on some of the standards that would be developed over time, specifically leading into 2001. There were, it specified that downtown area. It led to a fair amount of conversation about how our area is being developed, specifically the older portions of it. This map looks drastically different from what is ultimately developed, and that is based off of some KRS requirements, which I'll touch on here shortly. Gets into our initiative. We do get into standards in 2001, specifically with residential standards, trying to preserve what has been developed over time. We get into some of the Nd1 standards that are leading, or we start to think about Nd1 standards at around this time. There is the add-on of these standards. If you have looked at this plan, it really leads to what we are discussing with the residential character of downtown. Typically the stoops, the front porches, overhangs, and in many cases, we have gabled roofs that are required within some of our projects. This does have an impact on some of the other plans that are developed in the downtown area. We have our downtown master plan. It led into other projects being developed, and it led to a fair amount of regulatory changes throughout Lexington and specifically around the downtown areas. In 2007, this is where we get the actual adoption of the infill and redevelopment area. Now, this is heavily tied to KRS 100-201 and some language that I have in the back of your packet here that gets into why we are able to have these standards that we do have specifically associated with a defined area. This also led to a fair amount of further studies, including the housing market study, the commercial study and design study. There are several tax increment financing studies that were associated with this, specifically with upgrading a lot of the infrastructure in our older portions of town. And then getting into the historic tax credits. A fair amount of our H1 overlays looked at this and played around with our infill and redevelopment initiative. And then it led to the adaptive reuse program and some brownfield reclamation, which is also associated with our adaptive reuse.
What we're looking at on that map in the purple or red is all the H1 overlays?
Yes, sir, they are. So that does show that there was a real push to preserve, not just enhance or allow for some changes to occur, but to preserve specific areas of Lexington for the future. And that is, we are missing one, and I'll point that out, our newest one. My pointer's not working now, but the Pensacola Park.
Pensacola Park is...
Yes, on the base. They're just against the edge of the infill and redevelopment area. And I broke it, Chris. I just turned it off. There we go. So in 2009, there is the shift not just to focus on the residential standards, but also leading into some of the commercial areas. There was a study performed for the non-residential and infill and redevelopment areas, specifically identifying sites that should be upgraded or preserved, creating some redevelopment concepts, as well as leading into the South Broadway study. This is really focused in on some of the elements of trying to get that portion of South Broadway between the downtown area and closer to essentially Waller, in which we had the tobacco warehouses that were being underutilized, and trying to get them to be of greater utilization, higher amounts of housing types, integration with pedestrian and bike facilities. Some of those things we really got. Some of those things, they lagged behind for a longer period of time, and it took the Oliver Lewis Way project to kick some of those further along. So there have been several studies that originate from some of this that have really changed the nature of some of these areas. In terms of zoning ordinance text amendments, it really does start in 2002, in which we were looking at the flexibility and compatibility of residential options, so that it was creating provisions for small lots. This gets into the redevelopment area based off of the 1934 Sanborn map. Within the legislation of KRS 100-201, there is a date that is given, November 22nd, 1926. For all those planning nerds out there, that is the day that Euclid versus Ambler Realty was decided by the Supreme Court, saying that essentially Euclidean zoning was legal. So it set a date in which zoning itself was established. Everything prior to that date, and this is why KRS set it up this way, was housing development, lot development, subdivision that was not regulated by zoning law. So it gives a rational nexus for the establishment of this area as saying, well, at this date, there was no zoning. After this date, there is zoning. So these houses, these residential areas, these mixed-use kind of developments that happened before 1926, they were not encumbered by zoning. We went with 1934 because we found a map that actually indicated how Lexington was developed at that time. The Sanborn fire insurance maps are wonderful resources to look at for the historical development of our city. If you haven't looked at them and you live in an area downtown, it's actually very fun to look at and is actually eye-opening towards zoning. I will say that many of the things that we are trying to allow to occur a little bit more nowadays stopped in 1926 because Euclidean zoning does really focus in on the separation of uses rather than the complementary land uses and integration. So many of the zoning ordinance changes starting in 2002 were focused on trying to allow for that character to remain, to occur. And many of the zoning ordinance text amendments that have occurred since that time has sought to allow for greater mixed-use development. In 2004, there was that 1 year of the review of the amendments, and there were several smaller changes, but far less amount that were started in 2002. When Mr. Jimmy Emmons left planning, he dropped off a very large stack of materials on my desk and said, "Good luck." And in that, there is a list of the text amendments that were sought by the Infill and Redevelopment Committee. And I will say many of those have been reviewed, not so much just in the context of this body, but from an overall best practice standpoint in planning and with each subsequent comprehensive plan that has been adopted. So in 2007, we get the changes that increase the ability of mixed-use zoning. We get at the parking reductions, specifically the ability to vary your parking, as well as the ability to have some of the parking reductions on single family within the infill and redevelopment area. And then this is the first conversation that we get to have about the first ZODA associated with accessory dwelling units. And then that led on into that 2012 ZODA, which is focused on the non-residential aspects, shifting the B1 or the neighborhood business to be a little bit more front activated. So we pushed our neighborhood businesses a little closer to the street, so there's a little bit more interaction there and more representative of the historical development of commercial opportunities in Lexington. So this is the map as it is now, and as is representative of that 1934 Sanborn fire insurance map. It does show the different council districts that are impacted in this area, and it gives a little bit of an idea of the strangeness of development that occurred leading up until 1934, specifically with this portion of Versailles Road, which had a jump in urban development in which a neighborhood was developed a little further away than what was typically being developed, usually with especially historic development, that infrastructure doesn't jump the way that it was doing in the 50s and 60s. So that is an abnormality in some sense.
What's the green line and the light green and medium green? What's the color code here?
So I believe that those are meant to delineate the various different areas, council areas. So the yellow or with the darker black line is 1, and there's a lighter green, that's 3. So it's really just meant to show that, yes. So if you have any questions, that was a very brief review of a very long-standing committee that has done quite a bit in our community, and a boundary that is really held to KRS more than anything. So if you have any questions on what I've just presented, I'd be happy to answer.
Okay, I'll open the floor. That's great, I appreciate that. I was trying to figure out what I remember from all of that, and the answer is not much. I don't know, Stan, I don't know if you got a better memory than I do about kind of that interim period when we were both involved with the Infill and Redevelopment Committee as consultants.
In terms of,
Just what we were working on, and I mean how it fits with this description.
I mean, I think at the time when the IR committee was doing the 2012 or whatever report and recommendations, or 2009, there was like a double focus. It was continue the work of some of the things that had already gone in progress about the IR boundary, in particular the core. And then the first time, I think that was more focused on, well, but infill and redevelopment is occurring outside of 1934 boundary, so we should be a little bit more proactive. And so I think there was a lot of efforts, and there have been, but I always reverse the numbers, B, P, 3, and whatever. Those things, there's been much effort towards outside just the IR boundary. And I think that's what's spurred this whole conversation again is, do we continue on that path? Is there ways to continue to acknowledge that we've got infill and redevelopment both happening, and we would like to have it be encouraged outside of that IR boundary, which has been a Kentucky statute limitation? Is there ways to either improve or keep that? I think that's what got this conversation going was,
I think
what could you do to recognize current reality? And I mean, technically, I don't know what Sanborn maps we have that, it's now whatever, it's 80 years after 1934. So, I mean, there's plenty that would even, under any designation of even historic, be probably, I imagine Southland Drive and places like that at this point would be considered historic, under KRS. So, I don't know. I think that was just the conversation is, I think this committee and planning and the planning commission have tried very hard to encourage non-residential redevelopment and infill in commercial corridors. So to me, it's specifically about, is there a way to advance that conversation in a more holistic way? I think the new infill and redevelopment fund that the mayor announced, and I don't know if council has passed, I guess I'm looking at council.
Yesterday afternoon.
That's such a terrific step, even if it's not unlimited. It kind of begs the question to me, where does that get applied? Is it anywhere? Is it in places like what we're trying to do? I mean, the zoning efforts, you all can't rezone the entire city, but you spent a lot of time redoing text amendments for the IR boundary, and you've also done IR-oriented text amendments outside. I guess to me, and what we were raising, I think, and Brittany can jump in too, was just, is there a way to be more thoughtful and, not thoughtful, but more specific and take that next step on particularly the commercial corridors, the non-residential commercial corridors, not.
Okay, so here's the fundamental question. Maybe two at a time. The first one is, what is now allowed in the infill and redevelopment boundary that could or should be allowed, basically, the extreme anywhere? And secondly, is that infill and redevelopment is a different approach to take the infill and redevelopment boundary, and is it possible to modify the boundary from the lines that we now have?
So based off the research that Ms. Wade and I have done on the actual boundary itself, there is no way to expand that boundary, largely because it is tied to that date in which Euclid was passed, and you have that shift in which there was no zoning and then into zoning, and that is the KRS 100-201. In terms of infill and redevelopment standards, it has long been planning's perspective that we are infill and redeveloping as a broader perspective. And I think that it would get into what we want to apply for new standards from zoning perspectives.
I think, in other words, Vice Mayor, that what restrictions were lifted within the IR, say related to parking or setback or that sort of thing, if we thought that could apply appropriately elsewhere, there'd be no reason we couldn't lift those or make that just across the board for all B1 or all R whatever. It would no longer be just associated with an IR standard. It would be some other standard that would cause those to kick in, but throughout the throughout the county, really.
So at the extreme, again, I'll go to the end game. You take all of the lesser restrictive elements that are now in infill redevelopment, and you just make them countywide.
So some would not apply just in general. The small, one of the major elements of the residential side of the infill and redevelopment standards and the special provisions associated with them is focused on small lot provisions. That is the real focus. We have lots that are in the infill and redevelopment area that are far smaller than are allowed currently in any zone. And that would not apply to anything outside of that 1934 boundary because everything that was developed after that time met the zoning limits. So many of the standards, specifically the residential standards of the infill and redevelopment area, wouldn't apply and wouldn't necessarily need to be extended beyond this area. Some of the business side of things in terms of parking, variances to parking, allowing for a little bit more variation depending on lot size. For commercial areas, those are potential avenues, and I know that those avenues are being reviewed right now. And parking is being reviewed right now. Allowing for greater flexibility within all of our commercial zones has been reviewed and is continuing to be reviewed. I think the North New Circle Road corridor study will get at some of those as well.
Question?
There you go.
Maybe this is obvious to everybody but me, but why don't we allow the smaller lot sizes in any of our zones right now?
So that is largely a construct of
Single-family zoning. We created
Euclidean-
single-family zoning.
Euclidean-based zoning, specifically the variations in single-family lot sizes.
Yeah.
We have currently 5 single-family detached zones ranging from R1A to R1E. And each of those has a specific lot size, frontage requirement, setback requirement for each of them, and it has variability in their restrictions.
So your purpose changes. In the infill and redevelopment area, it was trying to find a way to allow development on an existing small lot.
Right.
You're changing your mission if we go to the areas where the lots are already conforming. You're actually trying to incentivize infill and redevelopment on bigger lots, which means you would then allow the lots to be smaller. So instead of saying, here's provisions for existing small lots, the alternative to that on the outside of the IR boundary is to allow for smaller lots. So go back through R1A through E and take the minimum lot size provisions and shrink them.
No, that's where.
But that would be.
Is there any benefit to doing that?
Oh, there's huge benefits to it, but it's extremely unpopular.
It is, so the initial, some of the
Extremely
initial
unpopular.
conversations for the infill and redevelopment area and committee was actually maintaining larger lot sizes, not making them smaller, in that there were a lot of down zones. So individuals were saying, right now we need to right size the zoning to make sure that we're maintaining single family residential options only. There was a fair amount of conversation with student groups during that time who had some concerns about not allowing for them to be in neighborhoods, not allowing for multifamily to occur, and some of they didn't say it this way, but the equity impacts on that. So there was that discussion early on, and within the field of planning, there is a large discussion about some of the impacts of large lot single-family development.
And just as an editorial comment, there are communities that are eliminating the R1 zone.
Yes.
Right. Not eliminating.
They're
right.
not, they're basically saying you can build a single family, you can do single family development, but you can't restrict development to single family lots. So there's some communities, I think Portland,
Minneapolis.
Minneapolis was the
so
first
there's
one.
places that have taken this on, but the comment that in this community it would be extremely unpopular that perhaps understates the case.
No, I get that. I'm not trying to be obnoxious, but have we decided that perhaps it would still be unpopular to have the smaller lots? I mean, the thing about it is I think that from what I've seen with the demand for downtown housing and like the shotgun style housing and things like that, I'm not sure that a new development, would it really be that unpopular?
Sally, just think about what we went through with ADUs. And how all new developments right now, at least up until the passage of the ADU ordinance, restricted ADUs in their covenants. So.
And that was before any neighbors even lived in the neighborhoods.
Right.
That was
Right.
the developer
Blank land.
self-eliminating it.
Right.
So,
There are areas in which there is opportunity to allow for greater flexibility with zones. Specifically, the R2 zone is one area that I myself personally and planning staff are interested in looking at. In that zone allows for 2 houses to occur on one lot, but it's a very large lot. There are areas in which we can go after things to allow for a little bit more options. And that's what this is all about. And I think in many of the communities that are looking at the elimination of single-family zoning, they're not eliminating the use. They want to keep the use, but they want to allow for individuals to have options. And that is specifically important when you have an environment, not just in an area that has a restricted urban service area, but throughout the United States in which building a house is expensive.
So I guess this was kind of the impetus. Did you guys see the article about the bungalow zoning? Was this kind of the idea behind creating that bungalow zone? It wasn't like in Ohio or something.
So there's bungalow. It's actually they're using it in different terms in different places. Following. I say this coming from New Orleans. Following Hurricane Katrina, there was a shift to the Katrina cottage and a focus on a little bit more of grouped single-family detached housing, in which there is less of a focus on parking. There's typically a parking court, and there's a little bit more of a smaller community that's developed. The bungalow housing is very similar to that. It is in Ohio, in which they are trying to allow for some of those things to occur. It's greater flexibility.
we've pitched that with the home builders, and the home builder representatives that are in this community, it is not part of their building model, right? So it's not something they know, so they're looking to see. They're dubious that it can work as a business model here, even if we legalize it. So in all likelihood, if we can create a cottage house, essentially ordinance, it's likely to be slow to be adopted because of just how small our builder base is for new development, single family.
But it's also similar to the B6P where we had, where in, what was it, 2016, where we allowed multifamily housing in the B6P and nobody really took advantage of it or started using it until the last couple of years, where we started to see some instances where that makes sense. So that's something that we've looked at and are talking about internally as a staff, creating something like that.
Okay. I'm done derailing things.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. And this may be a question for illegal, but I was just looking at the statute, and I guess I'm confused about how this boundary came from this and is limited. Were you all, did the determination that the IR boundary can't be changed from 34 come from, case law? I'm just trying to look at the statute and understand.
The initial,
why it's restricted.
the initial language that was originally written up is actually, it calls out specifically the urban residential zone.
Right, yeah,
And
I'm
that-
looking at it right now.
But in our written text, that's why it was kind of brought up, and that's how there was that legal nexus that was produced to create this area to allow for greater opportunity. So within KRS, there's three real kind of overlays in my way of understanding it. This designation within the pre-1926 stuff, which allows for variation. And then there's overlays, which allow for restriction, and that's your H1, and in our case, the Nd1. So this is the only area that we could find in which it allows for exceptions to occur that allows for greater flexibility, whereas the other overlays or ways that you can characterize areas broadly is a restrictive aspect.
And Brittany, it's not to say that the question could never be asked again, but it was
Correct.
our law department essentially that drew this map for us 20 years ago.
Right.
And they were adamant that not another inch, kind of thing.
Like 20 years ago they were at.
Right, right. And I don't know if there's any new cases since then that would
Yeah.
affect that, but the law department was very much involved in the development of this boundary.
Would it be safe to say that if we did expand it, it would have to be contiguous? It would likely be contiguous?
It would depend on what you're looking to expand it for the purposes. Again, if you expand it, the small lot provisions aren't going to do anything for you. The variability or the ability to vary, parking and a few side setbacks, front yard setbacks would be there. But it doesn't get at much more of that, other than needing to have your front stoop, a porch, or something like street activation.
Sure, and I guess, I mean, this entire conversation does stem from that desire to look at something creative and how can we expand the flexibility of what we're permitting, what does infill and redevelopment mean now versus 20 years ago and way before that, and then how can we create some kind of new framework that does encourage the infill redevelopment. We want to see that, came from all the work that you all did on Imagine Nicholsville Road and what will come from Imagine New Circle Road. And so from a legal perspective, and, I'm rusty on my legal analysis skills, not that I'm saying, but I guess that's a little bit frustrating. Alone that, is there a way to look at what that analysis was, and is there a reason to be able to expand it? And if there's not, is there another way that we can think about what it means? Because I think we run into the challenge, like we were just saying, if we just say, well, everywhere is infill and redevelopment now, we're gonna have a lot of community frustration. So the whole idea was, can we apply these different types of zoning and things that are permitted in certain areas where it actually makes the most sense, where we are going to see transit-oriented development, where we are going to see development on our major corridors. And so I'm going to pass this out. This is just if you want to pass those around. We had worked on, and I say we, but of course Stan's team was instrumental in that. This is a map that I think we showed you all when we presented on our Grow Smart plan. And it's got the infill and redevelopment map outlined in black, so that's the current map that we've got here. And then we just took a stab at, if we were going to expand the IR area, how could we do it? Where would it make the most sense? It would be on the corridors, and the colors here correspond with the place builder categories, so you can see those on the left. But again, we took a stab at what this could look like. And what it could be, and where would it make the most sense? It isn't everywhere. It's going to be a struggle, as we've seen, to get some of these zonas and things like that to permit some of these things everywhere in the county, because they're not really meant to apply everywhere in the county. And I do understand the limits that we're running up against in doing this, but I'm just wondering, I feel like our charge in this is to think about creative ways that we can work within the framework of the law, but also have an updated way about the way that we're thinking about infill and redevelopment and what we can do to actually encourage the development where we want to see it, which primarily is on our commercial corridors where we've got transit. How can we use and leverage infrastructure improvements and the infrastructure money to encourage infill and the infrastructure improvements that have to come along with it. So I just wanted to put this together for you all just to look at. Again, we know there are restrictions and barriers that we face in doing this, but it's helpful certainly for me, and I appreciate all of Stan's work on this, and it's certainly helpful for me, thought it'd be helpful for you all as well to see what we're talking about when we talk about where this could go, what this would look like if we expanded something. And maybe it's not due to the legal restrictions we face, calling it the infill redevelopment area and redrawing the boundaries, but maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a new category of something. I mean, I'm just kind of talking off the cuff here, but If we, are saying we're gonna focus on our major corridors and do transit-oriented development and all these recommendations that came from Imagine Nicholasville Road and that will come from New Circle Road, how can we do that and make a difference? And you can see here, it is on these major corridors. We're not talking about having these changes applicable in our residential neighborhoods and things like that, where we're not gonna see the most impact. It's gonna be in these commercial corridors. So I pose that for conversation or comment, and I appreciate all of the history, and I know this is complicated and you all are, again, face those barriers from a legal perspective. But I'm just wondering how we can further the conversation in a way that gets around that.
And there are, we do connect specific language within the zoning ordinance to adopted plans. Specifically, the most recent change we made was to the B2, B2A, and B2B zones for developers essentially to have to comply with the design standards associated with the town branch master plan. So if we have adopted plans that are associated with comprehensive plans or from the council, we can reference those plans within the zoning ordinance. This would be a specific review for special provisions within different zones that say if you are associated with the Nicholasville Road Corridor Study, you would be looking at these types of regulations. So there are ways to add special provisions within the zoning ordinance that allow for connections to other types of plans.
Can I stand?
And I'm sorry, because I'm not a lawyer and you aren't either. And I appreciate all the background. But this has always been a disconnect I've never understood. KRS 137, does that apply to all jurisdictions in Kentucky that have zoning, or is it limited to urban county governments?
I believe that section is urban county governments, but I can.
So I think that's what I've kind of generally always understood. There's certain parts of KRS that we think only apply to Fayette County, right? And so I just wasn't sure if that, because like the second, the disconnect's always been for me is that Louisville put Cornerstone 2020 and Louisville put overlays over everything. So I've never figured out like how is Jefferson County and Louisville allowed to do what seems to be much more flexibility in the same vein. And I just never legally understood it. Is it because
First class city.
they're a merged government and they made regulations in KRS specifically for whatever they are, and that's not exactly what we are? Is that the issue?
Yeah.
I'm just
Right,
trying.
they're like a metro government, and we're a merged government.
So the metro government has a KRS section and merged urban county government has a KRS section, and then the other jurisdictions have a KRS section. But this 137 is only for us. Or do you know? I've always been confused by it. Because I think Brittany's right, like whether we even change anything is, I think everybody's on the same intent, just like what are the options? And I've never even understood the premise just because it's clear that other jurisdictions are doing things we're not seemingly allowed to do. And candidly, have we just decided we're not allowed to, or are we not allowed to? And that's just always been a fundamental question I've never really, and I know that's for our law department and others, but I just has never been clear to me because it seems like a disconnect when you see it elsewhere. And I didn't know if maybe this KRS 137, I appreciate this because I've never seen, it's nice to read the full, but I didn't know if Louisville's using number 2 for transportation facilities and whatever, because most of the corridor overlays in Louisville are along corridors. But that would be a similar thing. We would, that's our point here is like it would be very similar. It's protection and improvement of major public health and safety and welfare along transportation arteries and others. And I didn't know if this is applying to all jurisdictions, is it that Louisville is using number 2 in a more aggressive way than we have been determined to be able to? It's just literally a legal question. I don't know.
Right. And we can sit down with Louisville and chat with them too.
Yeah, that would be great. There's an answer, or at least there's an opinion.
I think we're the two most similar jurisdictions that are struggling with both an older built environment and this kind of pressure and issue. And now we're both technically merged governments, even if they're whatever they are, and we're whatever we are. And I'm not trying to discount it or anything, it's never been clear what we can even look at in more detail. And like I said, it just seems inconsistent because there's so many overlays. In fact, there's an overlay over the entire county for form-based code. So I've never understood why are we, and now bear in mind, I don't think Cornerstone 2020 is great, but they did it. And I've never figured out why are they allowed to do things that we're not allowed to do. And that's not to say that it's Kentucky, and I understand they write things for specific jurisdictions, but I just never
Staying
understood.
in another part of statute, not 100, it starts to call out what urban county governments can do. A city legislative body, except for urban county governments, may by ordinance create overlays. And so there are other outside of 100 that
That
take us
helps.
back
That-
to.
So
There's
it's,
even taxes we can't pass because we're an urban county government that other cities can. I mean,
Again, that's not to say that the question can't be asked,
Yes.
but, you know, the statute seems to say that what we're doing is the limits of what we're doing is.
How did we do Oliver Lewis Way design guidelines?
Did the feds overrule it? Was the,
We got it during the zone change process. So within the zone change process and the adopted plans that were associated with Oliver Lewis Way, we were able to both implement new regulations within the zoning ordinance, but also have plans that were associated with the adopted comprehensive plan that modified things during that zone change process. And because that area was largely I-1, I-2, and B4, we were able to get a bit more.
and for what it's worth, I mean, whatever map it ends up being, or, you know, whatever area, I think this was meant, and we'd already done this was stuff we had looked at before because we think place builder is also so great, that it's really about the non-residential. I mean, I for me personally, and I agree with your point about residential zoning in general, but to me, the big fish right now is non-residential property along major corridors outside the IR boundary that
To that
people are already paying attention to and doing small area plans for, and it's just like, do you,
And we're seeing success there, though. That's the thing is, I mean, it's important to look at what the IR boundary achieved and what it didn't achieve. For the small lot provisions, it was very successful. For the non-residential stuff, it hasn't been because we created 3 mixed-use zones that are inusable. They're not functional. And so our response to that was to create B1 options that didn't require zone changes, that were knife fights every time we needed to have one, and allowed something to organically happen outside of the IR boundary, but also inside it. Same with B6P. Same with our mixed income housing parking things. Those are all meant to help everywhere, and they've been far more successful. In a lot of ways, the zoning ordinance has changed drastically since the creation of the Infill Redevelopment boundary. We've taken the lessons learned from the IR boundary and what was permissive and applied them everywhere. And then the things that the IR boundary was still doing a really good job at, like the small lot provisions, are still helping for underdeveloped small lots. But I just don't know that creating a surgical strike of special provisions for certain things, a la the MU zones, is going to produce the results that we're already seeing from improvements to the underlying zoning like B6P and B1. So my point there is I think our underlying zoning still has a lot of work that needs to be done for a community in 2020 versus when it was written in the 1970s. That's been our point. It's 50 years old and it's written for a suburban growth community. And we're not a suburban growth community. And so the ordinance doesn't reflect that. So our land prices reflect that strain. And so that's what we've been working on. FAR changes, parking changes, commercial intensity changes that apply everywhere because that they're going to have the biggest impact. And it still doesn't impact really the areas in between the spokes. All of those are really targeted at corridors and areas that are already zoned higher intensity like R3, R4, R5.
And I want to be clear too, this is not, I mean, I think y'all are doing a great job. I think that all the zones that have been put through, and I don't mean in any way to insinuate that it's not working and that it's not helping and that what you all are already doing it is not moving us forward, because it absolutely is. So I'm sorry if it,
No, no, no.
it came
No, no,
off
no.
that way
Not
in
at
any
all.
way.
No.
This is really just like, okay, what can we do as a committee to help this? How can we further it? How can we keep supporting you all and keep pushing it forward? And so I just want to be clear that it's not a criticism of all the hard work that you all have been doing. I know it's a struggle.
I think there's a way to
always
do
get
that
this.
in the corridor. I think there's a way to do that in our corridor zoning, which is still our B1, P1, B6P, and B3. And B3 is the real sticky wicket that we've got to address. And we're hoping that the Nudge and New Circle Road, because of how much B3 dominates that part of that result is going to be proposals to modernize and make B3 what we need it to be. I mean, it's not highway service business is not really the Lexington community anymore. We really need North New Circle Road to be something more than what it is. So that means a change to the text of B3. So we're targeting the entire corridors on these things and then trying to address the edges. I mean, the Nicholsville Road typologies are really about the edges. That's why there's 4 typologies, not just corridor typology, because clearly that doesn't speak to everybody. I just get a little nervous about us trying to make a potentially dubious legal distinction for something else when I think we have paths to us that we, for the last 6 or 7 years we've had some success. They've been hard fought, but I think we're making some real improvements on the zoning ordinance that are enabling infill on defunct movie theater sites and long not viable shopping center zones that for whatever reason haven't developed that are now becoming residential and still have the opportunity to have commercial in them as well. So I don't know, I think there's a lot of potential to take some more of what's in the IR area and apply it elsewhere.
And I think just to be clear, the construct, and it'd be for this committee to decide, and maybe that's the question before the committee is, what are the things that we can do? And in my mind, zoning is a part of it, but that's only, I think the point of this is more that, like, what does this committee think could be done more proactively, particularly in non-residential infill and redevelopment areas along corridors, in my mind. So I think the zoning is one thing. I think, Jimmy, in what you do is another big part of it. It's a facilitator and acknowledgement to council and everybody, like, there needs to be help. It is more complicated process, even with the text amendments. But I think a lot of it's just about putting your incentive program, like I was referencing, if you're gonna have an incentive program and you're like, we want to incentive, I mean, the carrot's much better than drawing lines and whatever. It's just more, and are we gonna prioritize complete infrastructure, transit, these are the same corridors. It's just like, to me, there's something valuable about bringing the public along and showing them, like, this is a concerted, thoughtful, and I think it is. It's just making it more manifest that this is the area we're talking about. And that's been our mantra from the beginning of all of our conversations about, the next steps is, can we be more, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but specific about where we think there's really opportunities and where we need this public support and we need the government support and we need the transportation cabinet support to make this happen, because it's not a question of the zoning. That's important. And I think this would be where you would audit zoning like you already are and do small area planning, which you already are. I mean, those are all related. It's just more looks to me, and it helps communicate to the larger public, okay, there is a very thoughtful, I can understand this because I get. And that's why I think Brittany was like, well, sharing this map was just more just the thought starter of, like, if you did think of it in that light, what do we think is infill and redevelopment area outside of the IR boundary, which is contiguous and is mostly on corridors and in our mind is mostly non-residential. But it does have a few complete neighborhoods because there's portions of some of these corridors that are still undeveloped. So it's not completely non-residentially focused, it's just primarily industrial and commercial.
Stan, I'm interested, do you all think that then, if we were to say that more definitively about the corridors, because what we've been saying for about 15 years is infill and redevelopment is a strategic component of growth for the entire urban service boundary. If we were to back that off and just focus on the corridors, what would that do to IR redevelopment proposals that are not in that?
I think that's a great question. To me, that's where back to the carrot thing. I don't think this is positioned as, well, this is where it is and this is where it isn't. It's just that this is where we're going to incentivize. We're going to audit the zoning. We're going to have redevelopment facilitators. We're going to invest infrastructure. We're going to make economic funds that are available for the additional cost. It's trying to get the biggest bang for the buck too of limited resources. And it gives, to me, support for what you all are already doing, because it allows you to just keep moving to the next. It's not like you would instantaneously do this, and it allows Lextran to support their mission and talk about investment in higher capacity transit in primary. And so there is a question that's fundamental, which is what corridors? To me, we're a hub and spoke, but you notice Tate's Creek's not on here. Now, that doesn't mean nothing's going to happen on Tate's Creek, and there hasn't been fights on Tate's Creek and whatever, but to me, in the big picture of things, if I was to incentivize where infill and redevelopment would occur, I personally would not choose Tate's Creek given its existing conditions, not because it's not an important corridor. You know, not all corridors are the same, I guess, is my point. And so this is also a way to start moving towards some notion of we have limited resources, but there's some corridors we really need to invest in.
I guess my concern is, would that essentially shut down IR if it was happening outside it, as far as the neighborhood perspective? This map doesn't say that you're prioritizing IR in my neighborhood, and yet here comes a private developer wanting to make a $20 million investment in building an apartment complex. So council, how can you even consider approving this?
And once again, I mean, maybe that's not IR. I mean, the whole point, it's like what that, hypothetically, what these areas are is an area of economic incentive and growth. It's not necessarily the city's IR strategy.
But you
And so that's
know
a
how
good point.
people will take that, though.
Yeah.
Once you graphically depict something or narratively depict it, then that becomes the policy. And
But I think people are already, I mean, they already feel like that. You know, in many ways, I think people are already, you know, have those reactions to things. And yeah.
there's no thinking, they do.
Well,
I mean, everyone is.
We see it,
Everyone
right?
is.
And I see it, and I know that you all see it. And I think this is more of just if we really are going to address the, you know, the problems that the whole country is talking about and are really top of mind, we are still going to, I think, always as a community have to focus everywhere. I think it's just more of a, let's talk about, to Stan's point, the incentives. Where are the main focus areas? Where are the biggest opportunities? There are still opportunities everywhere, but I think to that point, people are already going to be, there are going to be people that are upset about wherever projects are going. That's never going to change. That's not going to change regardless. I think people think if we expand, that won't happen. Of course it will. So I think this is more just, let's figure out ways we can put highlights on areas and focus some of these priorities. And maybe a part of it is in some kind of an educational component as well. And that may fall outside of the purview of what we all do. But Chris, this goes back to your point about the success stories of infill redevelopment. When I was in Tampa on the chamber trip, they were talking about how when they started really making a push for IR, because they don't really have a lot of vacant land to do any building anymore, they did an educational campaign about missing middle housing and said, actually, we already have this in some of areas of our community, like ours, like, you know, Meadowthorpe and Kenwick and Chevy Chase. We already have these. They were then outlawed by our zoning code. We just want to do ZODAs essentially to make them feasible again. And people, you know, of course there was pushback, and then they did this educational campaign and they did pictures of all of the places in the community where these already exist. So it was pictures of fourplexes and pictures of all these types of missing middle housing and said, this already exists, these businesses already exist. Here's an example, don't you love going to this neighborhood? Whatever it was. And that helped bring people along. And so I was thinking a lot about that too, and something that I've been marinating on, and is that something from a Fan Alliance perspective? Anyway, is there some sort of effort that can be done? And to your point, maybe it's expanded. Maybe it's not even just miscellaneous housing. It's here's success stories of IR. Here's the movie theater project. Here are these great things that we've seen that came as a direct result of the updates to the zoning code that we've made. Because I think visualizing it for people is so helpful. And again, that's really for the map. For me, I'm such a visual person. This is complicated and nuanced, and you'll know it better than anybody. Most people need, or not most people, I certainly need a visual to understand it. And so from the educational perspective, maybe that the pictures, the real kind of education in that way could be really helpful in understanding and people connecting what the ZOTAs are with the improvements that have actually come from the ZOTAs.
And the reason of the place builder tie is, for instance, not just to state the obvious, but 5 of the corridors are connecting to regional centers. So obviously from a transportation investment and whatever, we want to connect, it seems to me you could build a legal rationale if you wanted as to why and I think, Jim, your point is a really good one. I think the framing is really important in terms of not if or, but this is just an area where we're going to make concerted investment because we realize that to see what the kind of development we want to see, we have to bring all these things to bear. And these are the areas that we think can make the biggest impact for the city's growth and offer the greatest opportunity. And there's a lot. The other reason to make the map is it's a pretty big area actually. If you step back, that we've got. That's been our point the whole time, is we could accommodate a lot of growth in these corridors with a concerted, thoughtful strategy, but we got to also communicate and build community support that that's something the community wants to do. But I feel like the time is right because you set the precedent with these non-IR boundary text amendments, and the Economic Incentive Fund, whatever we do with IIJA is going to be a remarkable, in my opinion, opportunity for this kind of thing. It's just the good timing to us, and I think our horse that we beat for a long time, which is just having something that's physically on a map that's people can relate to, doesn't feel so. To some, unfortunately, it feels haphazard. So where's the balance, to your point of we're not going to say there's no infill anywhere else outside these lines, but we're going to say this is where we're taking some very proactive steps to try to incentivize it. I think the framing is important.
Do we have any kind of collected list of incentives that we've tried in the past and are currently trying to see which ones have failed and succeeded? Because we've tried a bunch of different things,
So
I think.
It's tough with incentives in general, just because you end up waiting 3 or 4 years for them to actually come to fruition most of the time. B6P, I would argue, is a fabulous change that offers a heck of a lot of incentives through flexibility. And we will be seeing, as Chris stated with the movie theater, but we have other multifamily options, a few other redevelopments that are occurring, but we're now 4 years after that got passed, and it'll be another 3 to 4 years before those are actually constructed. This is the fun part of zoning ordinance text amendment changes, is we're looking at not just what will be working in 3 or 4 years, but typically between 5 to 10.
It's how they want an incentive that the government thought was important 10, 12 years ago, was to dedicate a person to walk people through infill projects, and that's what Jimmy Emmons did. He was transitioned into that, and there weren't enough customers to keep a dedicated staff person in that. And then when times got lean, Jimmy had to be reallocated, and that position went away. So there have been things that have been tried, and you think they would make a huge difference, but they didn't. And maybe that's not to say you couldn't try them again, but some things have come and gone as far as incentives go.
I guess I'm just saying, if we're talking about incentives, it's worth noting what we've tried and the degree of success or presumed degree of success, and just so we know what we've done.
Well, I mean, it is interesting that there are things that have been done basically at the behest of the development community that have turned out not to be needed and not to be helpful. Most people don't think about that. I'm looking at the clock. We've got a lot. So I want to put a hold on this. I would like to suggest that we look at a time that not for the planning division to come back to us with the zone specific request to continue that discussion, but that we keep the infill boundary discussion on our agenda. I think this has been a fruitful conversation. I think it speaks to some small scale and some large scale strategic questions. So it'll be useful to continue. I know we've talked about on the table data review.
September? If you all want to wait that long. I'm going to be one of us can come, if we have a meeting in July, one of us can come and present, but I'm going to be gone for the months of June and July.
Okay, so why don't we say, we'll put that on for September?
Unless there's going to be a meeting in August.
Recessing.
Yeah. I think that'll keep, and people can, obviously,
Yes.
it's online and people can do some
Yes,
review,
and-
but it'd be interesting after some time for people to look at that, to have you here.
I will say also, next week on Tuesday, we're having a data release party for, it's going to be a super exciting party, for all the data after, so that's on Tuesday at 5:30 at Pivot Brewing. You're all more than welcome. It'd be great to see you there. We'll have a lot of interactive ways that you can interact with the data, and then it will be up online for anyone to see all of the responses.
Okay, so the question, so one other thing. We have on our pending agenda items, the planning process. That has been put into committee of council, a review of the planning process. So I would like to suggest that we leave that there, but that we don't think about moving it up on our agenda until that committee has had a chance to do some of its work. And then the calendar, if we were to look for a meeting in July, it would have to be very early on my calendar. Is there a time? Well, right, I guess the first Wednesday would be the 6th, that's in the July 4th week. Does that work for people, or is that out of the question? You're the-
I'm good.
Tentatively, let's put that on, and I will send something out that asks people to respond if they're able to attend, and if not enough people can, we'll just postpone it. So it's a placeholder, the 6th of July.
6.
Okay, anything else before we adjourn? If not, thank you all once again. Good conversation.